Hey guys, we're gonna continue with our video lecture today and you get to see me. So this lecture is gonna be a little bit longer because we're covering 3 sections today. So if you need to pause and pick it up again later, that's totally fine. So let's go ahead and get started. We are going to be talking more about westward expansion, and we're going to start with opening up Oregon. So at this point in time, Oregon was claimed by both the United States and Great Britain, and they kind of had a joint agreement of both countries could send settlers to Oregon. There you go, occupied and claimed jointly by Great Britain and the United States. Eventually, though, the boundary settlement between Oregon and Canada was set at the 49th parallel. I've shown you on the map how it has a straight line across the top of our country between Canada and a bunch of our northern states, and so that was because of the 49th parallel. So the boundary line was eventually established at the 49th parallel. The boundary for Oregon was eventually established at the 49th parallel. Now, the person who was responsible for opening up Oregon to the Americans was Jedediah Smith. Jedediah Smith, you learned about him in the last section. He was one of the people who opened up a bunch of trails because he rediscovered the South Pass. So Jedediah Smith opened up the Oregon Trail. Jedediah Smith opened the Oregon Trail, which, by the way, I hope you really enjoyed playing the Oregon Trail game last week. Jedediah Smith opened up the Oregon Trail. All right, you need to take note of this. Because of Mormon teachings and practices were deeply offensive to most Americans, the Mormons were compelled, or the Mormons were forced to move west and build their own settlements. So a couple of Mormon teachings that would have been deeply offensive to most Americans would have been the practice of polygamy, which means that a Mormon man could take multiple wives. So make sure you know that this is the reason why the Mormons moved, and you need to know this is where they moved to. They moved to Utah and established the settlement of Salt Lake City. So the Mormons moved to Utah and established a settlement in Salt Lake City. The leader who primarily led the Mormon movement to the west was Brigham Young. Brigham Young was responsible for moving the Mormons west. Brigham Young moved the Mormons to the west. And where did they go? It's right there on your screen, Salt Lake City. All right, the next area we need to talk about is California. The first group of people to settle in California was the Spanish, and the way that they claimed their land in California was by establishing missions. Missions were just were basically churches to reach out to the Indians in the community where the missions were established. So the earliest settlements in California were Spanish missions. Then, when Mexico became free from Spain, California came under Mexican control. So after Mexico got free from Spain, California and Mexico became a unified piece of territory. But the most important thing you need to know here is the earliest settlements in California were Spanish missions. All right, but of course California didn't stay that way, and Americans started to move into California. And the person who was responsible for opening the California Trail was Jedediah Smith, the same person who had opened up the trail to Oregon. At Fort Hall, the California Trail went west and a little bit south, whereas the Oregon Trail went north into Oregon. So at Fort Hall was where they split. If a person decided to travel on the California Trail, they traveled for about 800 miles over the Sierra Nevada mountains and then through a 40-mile desert. So you had to make sure that you were prepared with provisions if you were going to go on the Oregon Trail. Ultimately, approximately 100 and I'm looking for my notes. Where did it go? 165,000 people traveled on the California Trail to go to California. All right, but we all know the real reason why people went to California was the discovery of gold. So California gold was discovered at the mill of John Sutter. John Sutter was a Swiss man. He had bought land from the Spanish and started to make a community, and he had built a mill. And his mechanic, James W. Marshall, was running the mill when he discovered gold. And he noticed the gold in the water, and he collected it and took it to John Sutter and said, look what I found. They did a bunch of tests on it, and they agreed that it was actually gold, and they weren't going to tell anyone, but then the secret got out and the gold rush actually began. So where was gold first discovered? At John Sutter's mill. Gold was discovered at Sutter's mill. Gold was discovered at Sutter's mill. The largest number of people traveled to California during the California Gold Rush, and that happened primarily during 1849 when 80,000 men traveled to California to search for gold, and they got a nickname, and that was the 49ers. So the 49ers is the nickname for the men who traveled to California in search for gold. 49ers, nickname for the men who traveled to California in search of gold, because they traveled in 1849. If it'll help you remember, the football team in San Francisco's name is the 49ers, named after these men, the guys who traveled to California in search of gold. Now, of course, all the people who traveled to California were not searching for gold, and they started doing other things as well. You need shopkeepers, you need people who are going to be law enforcement. There are lots of other jobs that were necessary besides just the people searching for gold. But life out on the gold fields, everyone worked hard, no one was a snob, and then people started getting rich, so of course there were robberies, murders, crimes, all of those things. And so those were all of the things that were happening out in the California gold fields. All right, moving on. We're just going to read this. The major disagreement between the United States and Mexico was the southern boundary of Texas. So at this point in history, Texas has become a state in the United States of America. And so now the United States and Mexico are trying to decide where exactly is the border between Texas, part of the United States, and Mexico. So then, of course, there's going to be fighting. But America did try and work out things peacefully first. But Mexico didn't want to do peaceful things. So they actually ended up breaking the relationship with the United States. So they stopped communicating with the United States. They stopped the negotiations to try and figure out where that border between the United States and Mexico was going to be. So President Polk sent General Zachary Taylor to Corpus Christi, which is a city in Texas, and General Taylor started to move north to the bank of the Rio Grande River. So, oops, we're not ready to talk about that yet. We'll talk about that in just a second. And as General Taylor's army started moving towards the Rio Grande River, once they got there, the armies started to taunt each other back and forth, the American army and the Mexican army. And then we get to Resaca de la Palma, and that was another battle. And at that place, the Mexicans slipped across the Rio Grande River, but American sharpshooters ended up forcing them back, which means that the Americans won that battle. So After General Zachary Taylor was sent to Texas and to Corpus Christi, eventually a declaration of war was approved by Congress on May 12, 1846. So, declaration of war approved by Congress, which means the United States was actually going to war. May 12, 1846. This war was unpopular in New England. The reason it was unpopular in New England is because, of course, they're Northerners, and they were afraid that the Southerners were trying to find a sneaky way to steal more land to make slave states. Not necessarily what ended up happening, but the Northerners were always afraid. Remember, we have that delicate balance between the number of slave states and the number of free states. We have to keep it as even as possible. So when there's a declaration of war, obviously we need troops. So the Congress originally called for 50,000 volunteers, and way more than that ended up signing up. So just think about this for a second. The last war that the United States had fought in was the War of 1812. So that was 1812, 1813, and 1814. Now we're in 1846. So the people who are signing up for war now haven't really fought in any wars. It's been a while since America was involved in a war. But this war, the Mexican War, is a very interesting war because this is the first time that there was a press corps that was included with the troops. So the Americans back home were able to follow along really close in almost real time with what was happening to their troops in Mexico. So this was a revolutionary idea, and because of the telegraph, the people were able to follow along very closely with what was happening in the actual war. And now we do the same thing. Journalists are sent into troops and troop corps, and they report back to the Americans of what is happening whenever we're involved in a conflict. All right, so now we need to talk about the Santa Fe and California campaigns. So Santa Fe happened first. So Stephen Kearny took Santa Fe without firing a shot, and then he went to California. But someone had already beat him to California, and that was John C. Fremont. Fremont pretended that he was going to California to survey it, but he was actually working to capture it. So Fremont and his little band went to California, and they eventually ended up raising the bear flag over Sonoma, which is a region in California. And so we have the bear flag revolution, which if you look at the flag for California, there's a bear on it, and that would be why. All right, so now we need to talk about two of the generals who were involved in the Mexican War. And our first general is Rough and Ready. Make sure you know who this is. This is Zachary Taylor. He got his nickname because he was a brave soldier, but he wasn't so great at strategy. He wore a straw hat, a dirty linen jacket, baggy pants, but his men loved him for his energy. And he was able to capture the city of Monterrey, and the way they did that was in house-to-house fighting, which means they literally went from house to house and took over every single house. The next place that the Americans went was to Buena Vista. Americans had gotten a little careless, and Santa Anna, yes, this is the same Santa Anna who was involved in the war between, well, involved in the Alamo and involved with Texas. We learned about him last week. So Santa Anna captured some outposts near Buena Vista, and he was eventually able to attack the American army at Buena Vista. But I'm going to read to you a little bit from my book. So Taylor's army, so Zachary Taylor, Old Rough and Ready, was significantly outnumbered at the Battle of Buena Vista. They had reduced their numbers because General Winfield Scott, who we're going to talk about in just a second, had asked 9 of Taylor's regiments to come and join his army as they were getting ready to attack another place, Veracruz. But the orders for this transfer of soldiers fell into Mexican hands, and the Mexicans tried to capitalize on that knowledge and tried to attack the Americans when they were in a weakened condition. But the Americans ultimately won the Battle of Buena Vista. And so now we need to move on to the next two battles, Veracruz and Mexico City. Before we do that, we need to mention Winfield Scott. So Winfield Scott was put in charge of the armies in Mexico, the American armies in Mexico. And his nickname was Old Fuss and Feathers. And the reason he was put in charge is because the President of the United States at this time was afraid that Zachary Taylor was going to be so popular that he was going to run for president. So in order to try and reduce Taylor's popularity, he put General Winfield Scott into position. So General Winfield Scott is in charge of the battles of Veracruz and Mexico City. And so leading up to the Battle of Mexico City, there were several battles, and one of those was the Battle of Chapultepec. So I'm going to read to you about that. It's a city that is to the south of Mexico City, and it was part of a castle, and the General Scott's artillery bombarded the castle all day on September the 12th, and again the next morning, and then the infantry stormed the fortress from the west and the south, and in about half an hour the Mexicans surrendered the castle, and then shortly after that, well, the next day, the American troops were able to go into Mexico City and take over there. Pretty much with the capture of Mexico City, we end the Mexican War. So you need to write down these next couple of points because it's going to be about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and why it was important. So if you have to pause after we go through all of these, you can do that. So first of all, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was important because it ended the fighting between the United States and Mexico. So it basically ended the Mexican War. It established the Rio Grande River as the southern boundary of Texas, so the boundary between Texas and Mexico. Next, it ceded the Mexican cession, and we'll look at a map in a couple of slides, and I'll point out the Mexican cession to you at that point. The United States agreed to pay Mexico $20 million for the Mexican cession. And then last, it canceled any debts between the United States and Mexico because wars cost money, and so Mexico owed the United States money for the war. So if you need to pause to take note of these 5 things here, then go ahead and do that, but you'll need to make sure you know the importance of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. All right, so what were the results of the Mexican War? First of all, Manifest Destiny became a reality. Remember last week we talked about Manifest Destiny, the idea that the United States was supposed to own all of the land from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So with the Mexican War, that was finally a reality. Next, it's going to reopen all of these controversies over slavery, and we'll talk about that a little bit more at the end of this section, but a lot when we get to the next chapter. It was a training ground for the Civil War. A bunch of the really famous generals that we will talk about when we get to the Civil War, General Robert E. Lee, General Grant, General Jackson, General Meade, and General McClellan were all important generals during the Civil War, and they got to practice and gain the military experience during the Mexican War. And last, it provided new territory for the United States. Go back. You provided new territory for the United States. If you need to go back to the previous slide to get all of those things, then go ahead and do that. All right, the Gadsden Purchase. This was a piece of property that the United States spent $10 million for, and it gave us a little bit of land for New Mexico and Arizona. And the reason the Americans wanted this little tiny piece of land, which I'll show you on the next slide, I have a map, was for a potential Southern Railroad route. And the important thing about the Gadsden Purchase is it completed the territory for the lower 48 states. So when you think of the map of the United States of America, the Gadsden Purchase was a little piece down in the bottom corner between the United States and Mexico that completed what you think of when you think of the map of the United States of America. Hawaii and Alaska came later. All right. All right. Here's the map that I've been promising you that I was going to show you. So this is how the United States, how and when the United States got all of the pieces of land that we think of as being the United States of America. So if you look right down here, this is the Gadsden Purchase, and that was that little tiny bit of land that the United States ended up spending $10 million for. And then also here is the Mexican cession, and that is what the United States got with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. All right, moving on. One more provision that we need to talk about, and that is the Wilmot Proviso. And the Wilmot Proviso was a proposal that the United States ban slavery in any territory taken from Mexico. It did not pass Congress, and so the Wilmot Proviso never ended up becoming law in the United States of America. But that doesn't mean that there weren't issues over slavery. So let's talk about that. Of course, the United States, now that we have all this new territory that we just took from Mexico, needs to figure out what we're going to do with it and what we're going to do about slavery. So the thing that is created is the Compromise of 1850. Who do you think came up with this compromise? You're right, Henry Clay, our friend. So the compromise gave advantages to the North, but it also gave advantages to the South. So first of all, the advantages that the compromise gave to the North were these. First of all, California was admitted to the United States as a free state. So we have all the states that were in the East, and then you have a big block of unorganized territory, which is not states yet, and then you have California, which became a state. And then also, the slave trade was outlawed in the District of Columbia. So slave trade was no longer allowed to happen in DC. That doesn't mean that there were no slaves in DC. That just means no buying or selling of slaves in the city of Washington, DC. So those are the things that the North got as advantages in the Compromise of 1850. Of course, the South had advantages to the Compromise as well. First of all, New Mexico and Utah territories were granted popular sovereignty with regard to slavery. We're going to pause right here because I want you to understand what popular sovereignty actually is. It'll come up again in the next section and in the next chapter. But for right now, I'm just going to read you a short little definition of popular sovereignty. So popular sovereignty is the idea that the states get to decide whether they're going to be a slave state or a free state. So there were supporters and people who were against it. So the supporters said that the people in the territory should be able to decide the slavery question for themselves. This idea was created by a senator named Lewis Cass. But people who were against the idea of popular sovereignty, that states should decide whether they're going to be a slave state or a free state, were that the people against popular sovereignty said that they thought that people would move to the states to try and sway whether the state would be a slave state or a free state, and that's kind of what ended up happening. And we'll see that as we move closer and closer to the Civil War. The other thing that was a Southern advantage was the fugitive slave law. And that meant that if a slave escaped from his or her master and got to the North, if they were captured, they had to be returned back to their master. Before the fugitive slave law, basically, if you got to the North, you were safe and you would be a freeman. But the fugitive slave law didn't allow for that to continue. At this point in time, Zachary Taylor, old Rough and Ready, was the president, and he vetoed the Compromise of 1850. But he died shortly after the veto, not directly related, And the President Fillmore ended up coming into office, and he supported the idea of the compromise. And so Stephen Douglas ended up passing the compromise through Congress in 5 separate bills. So although it didn't end up getting passed as the compromise altogether, it did end up getting passed, and he passed them through the Senate. And then Texas received money for giving up some of its land. So if you think about the map that we looked at on one of the previous slides, you saw that Texas had this funny line that came up through it, and Texas doesn't look like that anymore. So Texas was given money to give up some of its land to become the shape of Texas that we think of today. All right, we are. And what is ending up happening to these great compromisers, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster? They're old and they're starting to die. And the people who are taking their place are younger and they're a lot less willing to compromise. And then we have this group of people called dough faces. And the new younger leaders on both sides of the slavery issue were less willing to compromise. And dough faces were Northern Democrats who were willing to compromise on the issue of slavery and on other issues at that point in time. These people, these dough faces, were very unpopular. So we are now going to be moving into the period of the 1850s, which is when we see things start to really get heated between the North and the South, leading into the Civil War. So that's where we're going to leave things off for today, and I will see you again soon.